Well, thank you, everyone. Yeah, my name's Daron Williams. I'm with Wild Homesteading. My wife and I run that business, and yeah, we have about just under 3 acres of land on South Bay, just by South Bay Elementary School. And yeah, I have a restoration background, and my approach to this type of work is really to focus on building ecosystems that provide, food for myself and my family, but then also support wildlife and the local environment in general. So I take a little bit of a passive approach to some aspects of this. So like I won't be talking about active irrigation using like hoses, sprinklers, that sort of system. I tend to try to not have to rely on those systems. So I just wanted to just mention that up front. So here, let's move forward. So,
God is
you
love, brother.
So, one thing I just want to mention real fast is the data that I'm using for this presentation was compiled by the Northwest Natural Resource Group. They're a great organization, really focused on forestry activities in the area, but a lot of the data it was really great local data, actually applied to the South Puget Sound, and sometimes that's hard to find on climate data. A lot of it's more broader, regional. So I just wanted to make sure if anybody was interested, this is the group to look up. They have a really great adaptation guide. Like I said, a lot of it's focused on forestry, but you can use a lot of it to apply it to growing fruit and berries and other edible plants in your own backyard. So going off that, just looking at the impacts generally. So over the next 80 years, we're expecting 3 to 10 degrees increase, which is really translated to higher minimum temperatures, especially in the winter, and higher maximum temperatures, especially in the summers. And but then also precip, one thing that's interesting in our area is the models there's a little bit of disagreement, but in general, we're not expected to see much increase in precipitation. Some models even show a slight decrease, but overall, they're expecting a slight increase, but not much. But what will change a lot is the timing of the precipitation, and that obviously can have significant impacts. So we look at things locally, this temperature, translating it to our local area. By 2080, one of the big changes is there'll be a lot more frost-free days. So right now, historically, we average, depending on where you live in the South Puget Sound, between 288 frost-free days up to 328 frost-free days. By 2080, that will be 327 to 350 frost-free days. Some areas will just have just a couple weeks of frost at all. And obviously, most of those won't be hard frost. So that's a huge change. But then also on the temperature side, we're looking at 21 to 46 days per year above 86 degrees. Historically, we've averaged 5 to 6. And I looked up 2015, which was, a big drought year. We had 19 days. So that would basically be a cool year by, once if we continue the way we're going. And then last year in 2020, we had 11 days above 86. And, so putting it all together, we're looking at drier, warmer summers and wetter, warmer winters. But one thing to think about is that it's the extremes that will really get you and really cause problems. Instead of the slow general increase that we're seeing. The models expect a lot more of a swing from dry years to wet years. So you're going to have drought years, and then you'll have unusually wet years, and then back to drought. And it'll be really hard to predict from one year to the next. That's sometimes why I like to call this climate chaos instead of climate change. And we're also expected, even though we're going to get roughly the same amount of rain, it's going to be in bigger events. So you'll get a lot heavier rainstorms in the fall, winter, and spring over a shorter time period compared to it being spread out over a longer time period. One way to look at that is events that normally happen once every 40 years today might happen every 6 years. And, that could have a huge impact, because if you have to replace fruit trees or shrubs or other plants every 40 years, not that big of a deal. But if you have to replace them every 6 years, that is going to be a huge impact. So that's something to really think about. It's these extremes that shift ecosystems, say like a forest to a savanna. It's not the slow, steady change. It's these extreme events that cause high levels of die off, and then the system's in a new state after that. So, just kind of looking over that, there's going to be a lot fewer chill hours. So, one thing that I've been looking at is, for example, a lot of these plants that I'm planting on my place, like my blueberries, for example, I'm only planting southern varieties of blueberries because they can live 40 to 50 years. And I want the southern ones that are adapted to very few chill hours compared to the northern ones that, while they grow fine now, they may not grow fine, or they'll grow fine, but they might not produce very good in 20, 30 years. And that, I want my plants to still be alive and thriving in that time. It's looking at these extreme rain events followed by drought. That's going to be, we kind of have that pattern already, wet winters and then dry summers, but that's going to get worse. And, to really put this in terms that we can all kind of understand is Olympia temperature wise will basically look equivalent to Sacramento by 2080. We'll have our USDA climate zone will be roughly 9B. Back in 1990, we were around 7B, and right now we're about 8A. So, we're steadily shifting that way. And Sacramento is warm enough to grow citrus. So that's, quite the shift. Even though our rain patterns will be different in Sacramento, our temperatures will be very similar if we follow a business as usual model for climate. So, looking at fruit trees, I already talked about the shift in chill hours, talking about, some varieties may not get the chill hours they need, but it's not just that some varieties won't grow well here. Some varieties just may not produce fruit. They may grow fine, but they just won't produce well. But then there's also going to be new varieties to try out. So, sometimes I like to experiment a little bit with plants that are on the edge that really like a little warmer, because again, if they live now, even if they don't fruit well, they can get established, and maybe in 10, 20 years, they might start producing really well. It's something just to keep in mind. It's also going to be harder to get plants established. Whenever I can, I plant in the fall because that gives them more time to get established. A lot of nurseries won't ship plants until the spring, but I still prefer the fall. And especially with these droughts, it's just going to be a lot harder to get trees established and get through those first few years, because of these droughts. There's also going to be changes in disease and pest pressure. There'll be new ones showing up. There'll be changes in timing of it. Sometimes it's going to be worse. Sometimes it's going to be better. This is a forestry example, but the Sitka spruce, for example, when it has a pest called, it's a native pest, it's a budworm that affects its the new buds on there. But the Sitka spruce is actually starting to bud out earlier, and there's in some cases that the budworm hasn't been able to respond to the spruce budding out earlier, so it actually makes the spruce have less issues with the pest. So yeah, it's just really interesting. It could be good, it could be bad. It's hard to say. But then in general, we're going to see more plant stress and we're going to see more die-offs. And that's just something that, I want to help you guys counter, because that's really what we're looking at. If you have a lot of variability, downpours and then drought, those sort of patterns, you're going to just see more stress. So, what can you do? So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on retaining water, reducing plant stress, creating and using microclimates, and then planting a mix of varieties. And the first one I want to dive into is retaining water. So the models show that the water is still there. We're still going to get the same amount, even a little bit more, but it's all going to come in the winter in a shorter time period. But we need it in the summer. So the idea is, how can you keep that water on your property? So one of the ways is just to build soil, but then also you can slow surface water down. And another great way is to reduce evaporation and reduce wind velocity. So looking at building soil, so this little picture up there is from the USDA, and it's looking at the organic matter in the soil. So for every 1% increase of organic matter in the soil per acre, that soil can now hold the equivalent of 25,000 more gallons of water. And if you increase your organic matter by 2, 3, 4%, which is doable. A lot of our land is very degraded. My own property, when we bought it, had maybe 1%, if I was lucky, of organic matter in the soil. So if I can increase that 3, 4%, I can start holding 75,000, 100,000 gallons more water, and that could translate to a couple months worth of water in the summer. So I really focus on this a lot. So I mulch everything, and I start out with wood chips to get started, to get rid of the grasses that are there. I've been transforming lawn and pasture to other environments, but then I shift to perennial ground cover over time, because that's strawberries are a great option. There's some great native local plants, so I use miner's lettuce. I also been experimenting with Pacific waterleaf, which is a native edible ground cover, so that loves shade, so that's what's nice about it. So, you switching to those. I don't till except to get a site started. Sometimes I'll do a first pass of a till to, as just to get it going. And then soil life is really where I focus, because the more alive the soil is, the more it will build. And it'll be easier to keep organic matter in the soil and to build that over time. And so this is an area that when we moved in was a gravel parking lot, and that's a little apricot, sweet pit apricot there. And in the roughly 3 to 4 years, I was able to transform this area from, it was so hard I couldn't even pound a T-post into it, to where I can go out now with a trowel and just dig in it. It's still gravelly, but the soil is transformed, and a lot of that is just because I keep it mulched. There's a native lupin growing there. That's a nitrogen fixer. I'll talk about some of the other aspects here, but I just really focus on the soil, transforming it, building it, and it's amazing what the results can do. And this area is too far away from my house to ever water, and so it's never been watered. And that tree was putting on about 3 feet of growth in an old gravel parking lot. Slowing surface water down. If you look at this, every site's going to be different, but you're looking for areas where it's flowing off, and you're basically thinking about how can you make speed bumps to keep that water, to slow it down. Because when the water slows down on the surface, that gives it more time to soak into the soil. And once it becomes groundwater, it moves far slower than it does on the surface. So that's how you have water that arrives in December still being available in July, is by slowing it down. So it's that old saying of slow it, spread it, sink it. Swales are an earthwork option. I just did a tiny swale the other day to deal with some flooding issues on my driveway that just directs the water from the road into an area where I have some native plants that can kind of help clean it, and then it's available to some fruit trees. Mulch, again, there's a lot of repeat on this because I'm focusing on building an ecosystem. And then also I use log and rock piles a lot because they can literally work as a speed bump, that just leaves and other material gather on them, and then that creates basically moist pockets, and it helps to slow any surface water down. So this was a few years ago. This is from a driveway, dirt kind of driveway I share with neighbors. And so I dug out a channel basically leading from it to a big mulch basin there. And you can see the water's just roaring off this dirt road into that mulch basin, which is about 3-4 feet deep. And then from there, it spreads out into an old pasture that one day will be transformed into a forest. But today, that mulch basin is covered in willows, and the willows have gotten up about 10-15 feet, and they love it there. There's some native willows, other plants, and it's just getting all this water that was just flowing away. Now I'm trapping it and using it and getting it onto my property. As this is what I call like a passive irrigation system, because it just works on its own. Then also though, once you have the water in the soils, you want to make sure you reduce how much it evaporates. So one way, of course, is reducing wind velocity. You can actually lose more water in your soil on a cloudy, windy day than on a calm, sunny day. So, one way I use that is to plant hedgerows and use those hedgerows to just block the winds. Also I use log and rock piles. Show a picture in a moment, but I put them on the south side of my trees, and it just creates that little buffer behind them that's a little more sheltered. And that was actually a trick I learned from the people doing restoration work up on the Elwha, where the big dam was removed. They found when they used logs and other things and planted behind them, that those plants did far better than the ones that were planted out in the open. And then, back to mulch. I use that a lot because if you keep the ground covered in mulch, it's going to stay cooler, and it's also going to stay a lot more moist. So this is a hedgerow showing just over 4 years. That's a native blue elderberry that we've, used and harvested from, just last year. And, really quickly it's grown, it's thriving now. You can't see the house from the same perspective. And, it's just a great wind block. It also creates shelter. It's great for wildlife. So, I really like to use hedgerows, and I've been putting them all along the edges of my property. Back to this picture again. So you can see those little rounds that I put down there. One's protecting a little tiny shrub that I just planted before this. And then the other one is on the south side of that apricot. And it's just, again, to create that little pocket of shelter behind it. So, key takeaway of this is, we're going to, the change that climate change is causing already is the timing of the rainfall. And we're also getting, of course, bigger storms and droughts. So the real question is, how do you keep that water that's coming in the winter? How do you make it where it's still available in the summer? So, really focusing on building soil, which increases how much water the soil can hold, slowing any surface water down so there's more time for it to soak in, and then reducing the loss of water once it's there by blocking the wind and just keeping the soil covered either with like mulch like wood chips or with perennial vegetation. Moving on to plant stress. So, the healthier the plants are, the more resilient they're going to be to climate change. So, one of these is again moderating soil temperatures, focusing on soil life. I also try to use shade to moderate air temperatures, and then reducing evaporation, reducing wind velocity again, and then reducing pest and disease pressure. So again, back to this slide, a lot of these things do repeat because soil really is key. We all know that, but it's if you can keep the soil moderated using mulch, a lot of times the big commercial orchards keep the soil very bare. The problem with that is that soil, if it's exposed to the sun, can really bake. It tends to not be very alive, and you're going to have a less resilient system in that environment. So, I really focus on keeping the soil covered, not tilling it, and just really promoting soil life. This area, when we moved in 3-4 years ago from when this picture was taken 4 years ago, this was all grass lawn, and the cherry tree there was the only thing really that was there. There was a few or kind of like wild roses too, but for the most part, this was all just grass. I had to mow under this. And the cherry tree, was doing okay. It was producing a little some, but it hadn't been taken care of. And, it was good, but it wasn't what it could be. So I've really focused on transforming this, made it a nice spot to hang out in the hammock. And since doing all these changes, planting all these plants around it, there little miners lettuce, other things, it's just really taken off and is just thriving. So we're getting huge harvests from this cherry tree. It's a pie cherry. And it's just been amazing how well it's responded to to the improvements. And the other thing is, thinking about shade. So often, we're trying to avoid shade, but in some cases it's actually a good thing, and especially because air temperature is not something we have much control over. We can moderate soil temperature, we can keep more water on our property, but we can't, keep the air from warming. But what we can do is use shade. So one thing, like on my property, it's very open. There's very few existing trees. So I want to plant tall trees along the west side of my property because I want to block that afternoon sun. So, looking at this is a hedgerow I've been planting. It's mostly natives. There's some non-natives mixed in, a few of them, but I have some pine trees there, the shore pine, which is a native pine tree. And one day they'll be between 40 and 60 feet tall. And they're all along the west side of my property. I'll be doing this in other areas too. And over time, they'll block that, hot afternoon sun. I'll still get full sun over all my property, but I'll be blocking that late afternoon sun. So, it's just something to think about. When maybe you're in a case like mine where your property is all open. In that case, consider blocking that late afternoon sun. Or maybe, you're in a case where you need that afternoon sun because you don't get morning sun. But, instead of thinking of the shade you do have as always being bad, think about it as something that could actually make your plants more resilient to droughts and those impacts. And you can also, use it to grow things that need shade. So like gooseberries are a great example that will fruit in shade. But then there's also a lot of native edible plants. I call them wild vegetables or native vegetables that grow in this area. So miner's lettuce, Pacific waterleaf, woodland sorrel. These are all great greens that will happily grow under fruit trees in the shade. And they're really quite tasty. I'm actually harvesting miner's lettuce over the winter right now. Again, goes back to reducing evaporation, reducing wind velocity too. That will help keep your plants just having less stress. Hedgerows are a great option. They used to be used historically a lot, and I think that's something that should come back. I'm doing them on the edges of my property right now. I've done about 400 feet of hedgerows so far, and I plan to do a lot more than that and to start intermixing them around, sometimes with trees, sometimes with shrubs, depending on how tall I ultimately want them to be. But you have a lot of options with them. They're also great for wildlife. They basically make corridors for birds and other animals to move around. But then, log and rock piles again can be used, and then back to mulch. I really think mulch is a critical piece. So this is a wetland area that I've been restoring. It was basically a degraded horse pasture when we moved in, but I've planted all these willows and chose this because it kind of shows all the elements. I have the trees, shrubs that are blocking the wind, helping to create shelter, lots and lots of mulch, as you can see, but then also these log piles. And these log piles are also slowing water. Surface water flows through here this time of year, and they're backed it all up. And it's really transformed from a degraded pasture to just a lush, abundant, wetland. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is an area that, it's a little too wet for a lot of the plants, like fruit trees, but just up from this on the edge of it, there could be great opportunities for me to plant some other fruit trees, and that moisture could be utilized for them. So, thinking about pest and disease pressure, I don't, one thing I just want to make clear, I don't use fertilizers, and I also don't use any herbicides or pesticides on my property. So I really rely on supporting the local predators. So, I had slug issues on a lot of my plants. So I've been really trying to increase the population of garter snakes. And this last year, we saw tons of garter snakes, and I see a lot fewer slugs now than I ever have. And, there was a thing in the Seattle Times, an article that said the average Western Washington garden has over 6,000 slugs in it. So, I'd rather get the garter snakes and have them eating those slugs than me dealing with them. And it goes with a lot of other pests too. The log and rock piles are a great option for that. That's what the garter snakes love. And that's one reason I have them. I've also had less voles over time as I see more garter snakes. They'll eat the young voles, they'll eat mice. They're really great to have around. Again, promoting soil life. The more alive your soil is, the healthier your plants will be. Soil life really helps with the plants to basically as a barrier to prevent disease. They also, like the beneficial fungi in the soil, a lot of times they'll connect with the roots of your plants and basically extend the root system pretty dramatically. Some people have called this the wood wide web, and they'll even interconnect trees together. And, that basically is just vastly increasing the size of the roots of your plants, giving them access to more nutrients, extra water. Soil life really is key. And then also native plants. So, we all know about the monarch. That's a picky insect that, that has to have milkweed for its caterpillars. But it turns out that that's not the exception. 90% of all plant eating insects are specialists like the monarch. So when planting native plants basically supports all those picky insects, and that then supports far more predators, which will then help eat the pests that do bother our fruit trees and berries and vegetables. So, this is just an example. I've put up a barn owl box just recently. I'm hoping that they'll move in. Their nesting season is in about a month or two. So we'll see if they move in, but got that up. There's a lot of orchards and vineyards that are starting to use this as adaptive pest control now. And that's one way I want to help to deal with voles. But then you can see this garter snake in the log pile. I see tons of them now. But then native plants. So this is, looking back at those lupins, and then on the left side and on the right side is a plant called checker mallow, which is another native plant. The checker mallow is actually completely edible. I just had a salad today with some of its leaves in it. It's beautiful. The miner's lettuce is another option, but then the lupin is riverbank lupin, and it's beautiful, but it's also a nitrogen fixer. So after it's flowered, gone to seed, I chop and drop it as a way to help build mulch. And that's one way I keep building organic material over time, is by chop and dropping and just chopping up material and adding that down. Even if I have good plant cover, I still keep adding that organic material every year to keep building this organic material in the soil. So, climate change is causing stress to plants already. And, so moderating the soil temperature, focusing on building soil life is one way to help increase the resiliency. The other is to, utilize shade. And, think about blocking that hot afternoon shade if you can. Reducing evaporation is also going to help a lot, just by keeping more consistent soil moisture levels. And then, reducing pest and disease pressure. I've had to fence my whole property off from deer, because that was one pest that just, there's no way I could, there's no predators that are going to keep them in balance. But I did build tunnels under the deer fence to let coyotes in, because I wanted to keep the voles under control. So it's, I made sure not to block everything. I focused on just blocking the one animal in this case that was causing a problem, because I knew I could support both my family and I, but also more wildlife if I kept the deer out than if I let them in. This last one, or this next one to talk about is creating and using microclimates. So, this one's a little interesting. We often think of frost pockets as being bad things, but in a warming world, frost pockets may actually be of a great benefit. So, obviously, there's cases where a frost can kill the flowers of a plant or cause problems. But if there's also plenty of plants that just need those chill hours or they don't like the hot temperatures in the summer, and those cooler areas could actually be very beneficial to them. And to say, for warmer areas too, they could let you try out micro or try out new varieties that you may not be able to try everywhere on your property now, but but on the south side of your house, that could be an option. So this is actually on the south side of my house, and we're going to be changing this up a little bit. Those spiky kind of tall grass like things, with the broad leaves though in the middle there were planted by the people that had this place before me. I want to take those out. I'm actually going to try some hardy citrus in both places that are technically hardy enough to grow here already, but I'm putting them in an area that, from my own kind of monitoring, I think is equivalent of zone 9 already. So I'm going to give them a shot. They may not work, but they might. I have a raised bed here that I grow tomatoes in, and it's right at south side. I also, closer to the house, you can't see in this picture, but I have a longevity spinach plant that is a zone 9 plant, and normally it dies back if it gets frosted. This winter it's died back some, but it still has green leaves. So, I'm hopeful that it's going to thrive and do well, and so far it's surviving our winter fine, even though it's normally grown in Florida and Southern California. But then this, going back to that wetland area down here, when in the summertime, when I walk down to this area, it feels like I'm walking into an AC room in the evening. Like, you can just feel the coolness. I've tracked the temperature here. It gets frost a good 3 weeks to a month earlier than my house does, which is up on the hill. And, this is too wet to plant, a lot of the fruit trees, which is why I've put a ton of willows here. It's a great wildlife area. But just up from it is a little bit of a slope, but still in that cool area. And I've been considering planting pawpaws along that because I'll have access to the moisture and it will be cooler. And that should help them do better. So this is just an example of, what is literally a frost pocket and wet, but it's an area that I can utilize to actually grow fruit that might struggle otherwise. And just up from this area, I'm working on kind of creating a blueberry bog environment that I plan on growing a lot of blueberries, again, kind of utilizing what's there on the land and, using those kind of cooler areas to grow things that might not thrive in other parts of my property. So, climate change is going to change which fruit trees will thrive in our climate. Frost pockets may be an area to extend what varieties will grow and do well. You have to be careful with that, which varieties you pick there, but they can be a good thing. But then also think about the warmer areas they have on your property. They might let you get a jump start on some of the warm loving fruit trees or other plants that might struggle with, but that will thrive in a warming world. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is really just focusing on planting a mix of varieties. The more diverse fruit trees and berries and other edible plants you have, the more likely you're going to have ones that will handle the shocks that are coming. It's really, climate change is making things unpredictable. We don't know what years are going to be really wet, which ones are going to be hot. We don't know if we're going to have a sudden spike. Always the charts show a general increase from like now to 2080, but you could have a year that just really jumps and then we stay at that new kind of level. So it's really hard to predict which way we're heading, other than we know we're heading up and that we're heading to a more chaotic environment. So, plant diversity of fruit trees and berries, but also plant diversity of other plants too. You're going to have a healthier ecosystem on your property that will make it more likely that your overall system will thrive. And, talking about this is kind of my backyard area. And about 9 months, maybe a little more before I took this picture, that lawn was there, but everything else in the close up on this picture was just grass. And so in that 9 months, there's a Asian pear here, there's arugula in bloom over on the side, there's strawberries, there's some there's some berry plants, there's tons of things here. There's peas, there's lettuce, this is all, there's blackberries, onions, there's a meadow here. This is all just in, this was a brand new growing area, and immediately I tried to get as much diversity as I can. And, now I'm adding more to it. I'm going to be adding some more shrubs. I want to put a gumi berry in here and some other plants, and letting it fill in over time, trying to get things more established. But even right from the beginning, I'll use annual vegetables to help fill in areas, even if I later want to fill it in with perennial plants, if I don't have them all at the beginning. So it's just getting that diversity, getting to see I mulched it all. I use logs. I'm doing all this to try to support what really is a living environment. And we're going to see this change with climate change. Not everything that grows well now will keep growing well, and some things that don't grow well now will thrive. And so, it's hard to predict which way that will go, partially because we don't know which pests and diseases will move in or won't be an issue in the future. So, we can kind of predict it, but it's generally my advice is just to do a diversity, but that can be a diversity of apples, for example. That there's apples that are from Canada that are much cold hardier. There's also ones that are from, that need warmer temperatures. So you can do a mix even within a single species. And, so it's not so, but always the reason I bring that up is because I try not to have so big of a variety that I don't know what to do with it all. I focus on the ones I know how to cook and know how to use and harvest. But within those specific species, I will try to find different varieties and try them out. So like I have 2 apples planted, 1 apple on the way, and they're all 3 are different varieties. They all interpollinate with each other, but I'm trying to make sure that I have a mix to keep trying it. And it's going to be a little bit before I buy the same apple type and repeat it, because I want to kind of have that diversity of types just in case one handles the changes better than another. But, I also planting a diversity of other plants. I plant a ton of native plants. My goal is to have native plants in every one of my growing areas. They're just critical to supporting a healthy environment, especially to supporting the predators that will keep pests under control. But, you can use those other plants to block wind, create shelter. There's help build soil, like the nitrogen fixers, like those lupins. So there's a lot you can do. And, I just try to go for really diverse systems. So putting it, kind of all together, I know I've talked about a lot here. But, we're going to have warm, wet winters with big storms. We're going to have dry, hot summers, and there's going to be more extremes and less predictability. So, there's a lot of things you can do. I didn't cover everything that could work, but the biggest thing I would recommend is to focus on building soil and keeping that soil covered. Don't leave the soil bare. Start with mulch and, use chop and drop, chop up branches, chop up things. Like Margaret mentioned, I've been collecting leaves, fall leaves, those wetland pitchers. That's where a lot of them went this year. And, that other that one kind of with the apricot, that little area there, that was all restored by putting down fall leaves and then eventually putting down wood chips later on. But the fall leaves were what transformed it from being hard compacted to being where I could dig in. And, so I don't get rid of any of my leaves. I want everything to stay on the property. I want to keep the ground covered. My goal is, though, to replace the wood chips and leaves with perennial ground covers eventually. My goal is to only see mulch in the paths in the future. But to begin with, I just keep everything covered. And so, just to reiterate, the goal is to retain more water, reduce plant stress, create and use microclimates, and plant a mix of varieties. And when you put it all together, you really do get beautiful, amazing, great areas that are highly productive. So this is my front yard. 4 years ago, this was all grass. None of these plants were there. And, in this, there's aronias, there's gummies, there's raspberries, there's strawberries. I have a mulberry, 2 cherries. We're going to be putting another mulberry. There's a service berry. There's multiple vegetables, both annual and perennial in here. Tons of native plants, and we get just hundreds of birds here all the time. Lots of other wildlife, and I get huge harvests from it. And there's gooseberries too. I mean, there's just a ton in here, and it's beautiful to look at. And my kids love watching. We watch the birds every morning. And one thing I've learned is that when you build the abundance like this, you don't have issues with birds. My cherries don't get eaten by the birds. They'd rather eat the red flowering currants, which are a native plant that has fruit at the same time. They rather eat the native other berries that I have in here, like twin berries. There's so many options here that the fruit tree doesn't stand out. It's just one little piece in a wide range of abundance. So it's a younger system. Like I said, this is only 4 years old, but everything's growing, thriving. And I don't water this at all. I don't fertilize it. Just focus on building a healthy ecosystem. So appreciate it. Thank you all, and happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. One person asked in the chat, how do you encourage snakes? And I think you were talking about the rock and the wood piles, which is their habitat that they love.
Yeah, they really need cover. So the garter snakes, the ones here in Western Washington, they're one of my best friends because they love to eat slugs. But they eat other pests too, and they really just need cover. So the plants, the thick plants are a great option, but also, these log and rock piles. So, you can see some in this picture that I've put in, and I put them all over. So they use that to hide during the hottest parts of the day. They'll come out and sun on them in the morning. And then they need places to hide from predators. There's a lot that eat garter snakes. So hawks will swoop down and catch them. They need places to hide too, especially they're young. But then also in the winter, they will get under, large kind of log piles, rock piles down in burrows, and that's how they overwinter. So if you don't have any of that, they won't hang around. They might show up occasionally, but they won't, without that shelter, they won't stick around.
Right. And I think I read, don't they have a 1 year, what's the word? They reproduce once a year. So you might not, if you might not see anything much different the first year, but after you provide all this stuff for them the next year, they'll have a chance.
Yeah, and they give birth to live young. So you'll see when it is their time to for the young, you'll start seeing these tiny little garter snakes around. And it has been a slow increase for us. Like this last year was really the kind of year where we couldn't miss them. Like they were everywhere.
Excellent. All right. Oh, this was a question I had too, which someone asked in the chat, which is, where do you source all those logs that you use for the piles in the garden borders? They're beautiful, and besides all the benefits you mentioned.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Mix. So I use Nextdoor, that site a lot, social media in general. People on Craigslist are often posting times with free logs. You just have to kind of be ready to jump on it.
Right.
That works. I did have some local connections with some local nonprofits. There's a Center for Natural Lands Management does prairie restoration, and sometimes they don't want the trees because they're trying to restore it to a prairie. So a lot of mine came from some of their sites. But then I also, I'll reach out to groups that are doing restoration work where they're not focused on forests like that. Native plant salvage, they do their plant salvage, and I've managed to grab a few. So like that snag that you can see in this picture that's standing up there, that was one that I got out of a forest that was going to be bulldozed.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. A related question is, where do you get your wood chips?
So there's a couple places locally that you can go and pick it up for free. I think it's Double D Trees like service company. They're by Black Lake, just a little bit past it. They have a place where you just drive down and you can, if the piles are there, you can just fill it up and take what you want. They just they do tree clearing and trimming for people. So they generally, this time of year, there's tons. In the summer, it gets picked over quite a bit. The county's kind of waste treatment area that's not too far from Lacey, that's just kind of on the edge there by that dog park. They often have a big pile of wood chips there too from all the yard debris that's brought in. There tends to be a little bit of plastic mixed in there, but not too bad. I just pick through it, but I like to get it from other places. But then also you can, watch for tree trimming companies in your area, call them up. One day the county, they were doing a bunch of clearing up and down the road I live on. And I think I got about 4 dump truck loads for free from them that day.
Yeah. So it sounds like you just kind of have to be proactive sometimes and go out there.
Yeah.
Question on that, if I may.
Yep.
You like from Double D, they trim all kinds of trees, including ones that are diseased. Is that a concern ever?
I don't worry about it for the most part because WSU's done some research into it, and in general, the diseases that are coming in, they won't transfer from. There's never been a case they found where they could get mulch to transfer diseases to trees unless it was being dug into the soil. So if you're just keeping it on the surface, but one option is to let it sit and compost. If you're worried about it for 6 months or so, to be safe. By that time, there won't be anything that would have caused problems. I've been doing this, now for several years, and I've never had a single disease show up. I don't, the WSU's study didn't find any issues either. They said the only way they could get diseases to transfer was if they knew it was diseased, it was active, like fresh, and they were digging it into the ground, because then it could move into the soil and get into the roots. But if it's just laid on the surface, they didn't have issues.
And just a quick related, do you care whether it's conifer or other hardwoods? Does it matter?
You can use any of them. If I can, I avoid like junipers and cedars, just because they're not as good. Once they break down a little bit, they're not a problem, but things don't like to grow in them, but often, other than those, it doesn't matter too much. What I have found is the hardwoods break down faster. So if you're trying to build soil, they're definitely what I prefer, to get. But most time I find I tend to get like Doug fir, or other conifers. That tends to be more common, though alders are not rare in our area either. So, in those cases, I take what I can. I've actually recently started composting my wood chips. So, get some horse manure from my neighbor and take green clippings. I mix it all together. And the result is this really nice, well broken down kind of wood chip compost mix that it's a really rough compost, but the plants love it. It's been really great. I've even been able to start seeds and cuttings in it. That's kind of been a way I use that in my vegetable garden, kind of using that in areas with that. My paths, I don't want it to break down more. So actually I love it if I get a load of conifers, sometimes I'll just keep that on my paths because I want that to last longer. But everywhere, I get mushrooms coming up in it. It breaks down pretty fast. And I've never, I don't worry about it too much.
I don't have a question, but I've noticed when we've gotten the big piles of wood chips that they generate a lot of heat, so that when you have them piled up, so that would kill a lot of things too, as you said, in the process of composting.
Yeah, and if you're worried, you can just leave them and let them sit for a while.
Calves we used to love to sit on top of the piles and stay warm in the winter.
Definitely. Yeah, I've actually had to be careful a few times. I've been getting bare roots and I needed to heal them in, and I would have to be careful which pile I stuck them in because some of them were too hot.
Daron, are you available to provide consultations?
Potentially, yeah.
So how do we reach you?
Well, Wild Homesteading is my site. So if you go on to just wildhomesteading.com, there's a contact info on there.
Okay, thanks.
There's another question about how do you keep blackberries out of your hedges and grass?
Yeah, the blackberries have been an ongoing issue for me. When we moved in, there was over 1/3 of an acre of very dense, thick blackberries on the property. So one of the first things I did is I mowed them all down just to kind of reset it. And, I've been grabbing them out. I try to keep them cut. This last year, I wasn't very good at being consistent with it. So I'm getting caught up this winter. If you keep them cut back, basically when they hit knee high, if you cut them again and just keep cutting them, they will eventually die out. They can't handle that forever, but you have to be consistent about it, probably for a good year before you'll eliminate them, especially if they're on your neighbor's property, because they're likely the roots are coming in from the neighbors and that's going to cause issues. But blackberries don't like shade. So one thing is, over time, if you can get enough shade down, you will kind of shade them out. Our native blackberry doesn't mind shade, but it stays on the ground for the most part. It's actually really tasty when you can get fruit from it. But the Himalayan and evergreen blackberries, which are the two invasive ones, I just keep them cut back and dig them out as I can, and then keep cutting them and keep the shade. And the more shade there is, the less they do. But it's definitely an ongoing issue. There's areas on the edge of this hedgerow in the picture that I'm still cutting back blackberries and slowly shading them out.
And can you name some of the native plants that you encourage?
Yeah, so some of my favorite ones in a hedge environment are like red flowering currants. I didn't have a picture in this presentation of them blooming, but they bloom very early spring. They're one of the first ones to bloom, and they're just gorgeous at that time. You can make a tea out of their flowers. And I love them. They grow really well. I also grow oso berries, sometimes called Indian plum. I have them mixed together. They're really great, especially early spring. They're one of the first to leaf out and also to bloom. So them mixed with the red flowering currants, you get the white flowers and the pink red flowers. And it's just really pretty. And then I like a cascara. It's a native tree. It doesn't get very big. There's a lot in this hedgerow, and they're not edible. They were used medicinally in the past, and they actually used to be used by the pharmaceutical industry. Some actually decreased their numbers pretty severely in our area because of that. But today they're not really used in that way anymore. But so I like them. They're just a tree that gets up no higher than 20 to 30 feet, generally 20 to 25 feet. So there's a nice kind of small, deciduous tree. Those are really great ones. Nooka rose I really like to put it on the outside of my hedges, on the side like facing a road or the area where I'm gonna have deer pressure, because they form really dense hedges that are very, very thorny. Nothing wants to go through them, and they can take browse. The deer like to eat them, but they only eat the young soft shoots, and the Nooka rose just seems to get denser when the deer browse on them. So there's a mix of lots of others that can work too. The elderberries can be good. Blue elderberry likes hot, kind of drier conditions, sunnier, but it does fine in a little bit moist areas too. And then red elderberry likes more forest edge, a little shadier. Black twinberry is another great one. And then I use the riverbank lupin a lot. So all my hedges kind of have that mixed in too. And, they're a nitrogen fixer, so they just kind of help boost it. And they tend to bloom on their second year, and they get woody, but they're really nice.
Where do you get the seed for the lupin?
Riverbank lupin, there's a seed company. There's a couple different seed companies, but Silver Falls sells them in bulk for a pretty good price. And I've had good luck getting them to germinate just by broadcasting them on top of mulch. They just seem to germinate through it pretty easily. But if you give them a little care, give them a little bare soil, they germinate quick. If you like, when I broadcast ones on one site that I was working at in October, within a month they were already up and germinated, and then by the following spring they were getting up knee high. So they germinate quickly and easily. They're a really great native lupin.
And how thick is your initial wood chip layer?
It depends on the area, what I'm fighting. Some areas, if I know I'm planting a bunch, I try to keep it not too dense, so maybe 3 inches. But if I know I'm facing some really kind of tough grasses, especially if I'm dealing with canary grass or things like that, then I go 6 inches, even up to a foot in a few cases. But most time I try to stay below 6 inches and often around 3 inches, because it's too hard to get enough wood chips to do, a foot everywhere. And it's also hard to plant into that.
So you can actually get rid of reed canary grass?
You can. Yeah, I've mulched it successfully. You have to put down cardboard or burlap bags first. I do sheet mulching to get rid of grass. So this whole area that you're looking at here, almost all of it had cardboard put down first, and then wood chips put down on top of that. And I find if it's not over the summer everything's dry, so the cardboard lasts longer. But if I put it down at the end of summer, within like 3 months, it's gone. And so is the grass. So then I can just kind of dig into it afterwards and plant pretty quickly.
Do you have a lot of voles?
We do have some vole issues, but I've actually found that over time it's been diminishing. They like the sheet mulching, and so when I newly sheet mulch an area, they will make tunnels underneath the cardboard. But once the cardboard's gone and it's just the wood chips and I start getting plants in, it's not too bad. And that's one reason, though, I did put up the barn owl box, was to start reducing their numbers. But so far each year we are having less than we had the year before, as I've been doing all this work. They like the grass. The grass is really easy for them to tunnel in. They can make tunnels on the surface of the grass. So as the grass goes away, there's definitely, I find, less voles as opposed to more.
So you wouldn't say that using the cardboard for sheet mulching makes it worse?
Potentially right at the very beginning, depending on what season you do it. If you do it in the spring, they'll move into it when they have young, but it's temporary. It doesn't last.
Huh.
Have you had issues with rabbits, or do your predators take care of the rabbits as well?
Rabbits show up every year, but they don't tend to last. So I'm assuming the predators are getting them. We did see 2 hawks take out a rabbit. They're in our area. They show up, but they've never been a major issue. I've also discovered the ones in our area, like in my place, actually really love dandelions, and they seem to go after all my dandelions and leave most of the other plants alone. But they did chew up my hazelnuts. That was annoying because all the new growth on my hazelnuts got chewed up one year. But so far that hasn't happened this year. And it's an ongoing process. One thing with predators is the pests have to show up first. So without pests, you don't get any predators. And the question is kind of, do you just keep fighting the pests constantly and basically be the predator yourself year after year, or do you give time for the predators to show up? So I haven't tried to get rid of the rabbits so far. They haven't been a major issue. And we did have a weasel show up for the first time, which could help with the rabbits. And we just talking about other predators showing up. We had a great blue heron show up to our wetland for this year, actually a couple times. Obviously they're not going to go after rabbits, but it's just a sign of predators moving in.
Yeah.
But then the barn owl box, I'm hoping they'll help. And we have hawks that hang out here, and the coyotes, we invite them in. So it's just kind of when there are predators, I tend to focus on just what can I do to attract them.
Yeah, I love your idea of cutting holes in the deer fence, in the bottom of the deer fence, to let the coyotes in.
Yeah, I actually used logs and wood and things, basically just kind of made tunnels that are too long for the deer to be able to get through, but the coyotes go through it all the time. They have trails that are worn into the grass coming and going through those tunnels.
Yeah, that's excellent, because like we put up deer fencing as well, and the rabbits promptly chewed little their own little doors on them. So
yeah, it's the deer are the only thing I keep out. Everything else I try to work with, and the deer I tried to work with at first, but it was just causing too much problems.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Someone asked if you can purchase garter snakes anywhere to get the start if you don't have any. Does anyone?
I haven't seen anything like that. What I would say is they're there. If you live in this area, they're around. You may not see them, but once you start creating the habitat for them, they will show up. They're all over. They're pretty common, but they love to hide. So, and if there's not, so they're hard to spot. I tend to spot them when they're sunning, and we just have such a high number of them now. But when the past years, we would see them occasionally, but it was pretty rare to find them. And there's just really increased numbers. And so my thought is, I think they will show up if you just start creating the habitat for them.
Although, it's interesting, you're by water, and I think they really like to be close to water or marshy habitat. And
no, it is true.
I also think that, we put out water for them, and we actually found them in sort of swimming around, the little ones swimming around in the water. So
yeah, I actually just put in a wildlife pond, that's what I call it, up by my garden. That's a lined pond, and its main purpose is to attract more garter snakes and more frogs up near our pond. There are roughly, I think, 4 different species of garter snakes in our area, and a couple of them are more upland, and they aren't as reliant on water as the other, at least one of the other ones that is very semi-aquatic and tends to only be found near water. So even out away, they should show up, but it is harder. And if you're in an urban area, you will see less of them. But I'd be wary about buying them, partially because there are just so many garter snake species around that you could very easily get ones that aren't actually native to our area. And they all look pretty similar.
I'd like to know if you water your plants to establish them at all?
It depends on the area. So seeds, I definitely do. So like this last year, I was doing new meadows, and we had some hot, dry spells in April, and I had to water them to help get them established. I didn't have to water them later. Those fruit trees in that one area I was sharing, I never watered them because they were just too far away. Like there's no way I can get a hose out to them with enough pressure to do any good. So it kind of depends. I do water them if they don't have a good mulch layer, and it also depends on when I get them planted. So the plants I plant in the fall, I've never had to water because they have time to get established, and because I mulch everything and do all that, I haven't had issues. The plants that I can't get until late March or April, or it's occasionally even May, those ones I definitely do water the first year. But my goal is by the end of the first year to not have to water them at all.
And what about your annual? Do you do annual veggies kind of interspersed, or do you have a separate area for those that you water?
I do have a kitchen garden and a terrace garden. It's a mix, so I will give them water sometimes, but I tend to do kind of a really deep watering maybe once a month for those. And my goal has still been to build up the soil. So my goal is to eliminate that watering too, if I can. It's just, it's interesting. There in Southern California, or actually Central Valley of California, I mean, there's farmers there that are growing tomatoes with no irrigation whatsoever, and they don't water them at all. So, it's interesting. There are ways to do it. It does take sometimes the right variety. You have to have this soil that's deep enough and rich enough, with that organic material and alive. But there are strategies to do no water gardening. And,
Right.
my goal is to transition to that. So this year I did do some watering, or this last year, but I try to eliminate that. My potatoes though were grown with no watering, and they were also no-till potatoes. So, there's a lot of options. It takes time and sometimes finding the right varieties.
Someone asked, do you use gray water? And I also wondered if you ever, if you collect water, or if you have any plans to collect water.
Yes, a lot of what I do collecting the water is kind of passive, or systems like that, shared with the water running off that driveway into that mulch
Right. Yes,
pit.
I guess what I meant was more like barrels.
Yeah, I actually have 4 water tanks that are not set up yet that I have plans to capture the runoff from the roof. All the runoff right now is kind of directed into areas that, is benefiting the land. It's soaking in, but I do want to start collecting it. Just a lot of that is actually for the watering I do have to do. I'd rather be using the rainwater if I can, but we're on a well and we're on a septic system. So right now I'm not doing gray water, like in terms of from the house, but that's a long-term plan, to shift to that. We just haven't had time to do it. The
Right.
last, 4 years, just been getting it set up here, getting established. We also had 2 kids during that time. So it's just, not enough time to do everything.
There's never enough time.
I had a question.
I can't, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. People talk about adding organic water matter to the soil, and I'm still pretty new, definitely new with trees. And I think I always get confused because I think the tree's roots go down so deep. Would you have to dig the organic matter deep in? But it sounds like you're just putting it on top and you're not worried about getting it tilled into the soil. Like
Yeah.
I can't get my head around that.
Yeah, if you till it in, you can actually cause problems, because as organic matter breaks down, like if it's fresh organic matter, it locks up nitrogen. It takes nitrogen to do the decomposition. So you till it in, you can actually cause nitrogen deficiencies. So that's one reason why it's always on the surface. But those plant roots actually are the way to get organic material down deep. So, plant roots grow, they die back, they're not static. So as they die, they basically become organic material. As you promote soil life, those soil life will also tunnel down, and help draw it down further too. So you start getting this mix in that way. And there's kind of a cool thing where, I don't want to get too technical, but the plant roots release what's called exudates. And they're basically little packets of sugars and proteins and carbohydrates, different things that they release it into the soil, and that actually feeds soil life. And, so as you're promoting soil life, basically the plants are feeding the soil life, and in return, the soil life is, through their kind of biological actions, they're releasing nutrients that the plants need. So it's this kind of back and forth, in some ways symbiosis between these. And over time, you do get that organic material to build up or down deep. But and really the plant roots is the way to do it. That's why I go for perennial ground covers, because a lot of them do die back. So it's just all those roots, they die, in the winter, some of those roots might die back, and you just get that constant pulse. And it seems little, but if it's happening every day, so it's just constantly building up. And it does take time, but if your soil's alive and you get living roots in it, you will build that up even down deep over time.
Okay. that, oh my gosh, that begs a question. So when you talk about building up soil life,
Mhm.
is it just by adding organic matter that you're building soil life, or is there something else that you do when you talk about building soil life?
Yeah, I mean, it's one reason I like the wood chips and the logs too, is because there's, fungi and bacteria and nematodes and other things on all this stuff already, depending on, especially if it's composted. But
Yeah.
then I've also, I have a worm composting system that I get, basically the water that collects from it goes into a bucket, and I spread that around because it's filled with beneficial critters
Yeah.
too. That's one reason I make compost. And two is, because that's filled with just tons of beneficial soil life. If it's a healthy, well aerated compost, it doesn't smell bad. If it smells bad, that's probably not going to be good for your soil life. The soil life will build over time on its own, but it just from having the organic material there. But you can do those things. I've also gotten mushroom starts, king stratifolia, wine cap mushrooms. I've put them in places to kind of start cultivating them. They're really great at breaking down wood chips and speeding up that process of soil building, and you can eat them. So,
Cool.
They're great. We
Yeah.
planted lots of those last year and had so many mushrooms.
yeah, so those are great options. So it's kind of like it will happen over time, but you can jumpstart it with like compost. It's a great way to do it. I haven't had time to do this yet, but you can make compost extract, which basically you take a bucket, fill it with water, get like a mesh bag with compost, very fine mesh, and just kind of soak it in there, aerate it. An aerator is a great option, and you just do it for a couple hours, and that basically you get just this tea. It's an extract, but it's just filled with soil life and beneficial organism in general, and also some nutrients. But it's the soil life that I care the most about, and you can then spray that all over, and it's a way to make the compost go far further and to jumpstart the soil life. And there was a study recently done where looking at the soil life and compost, where they just did a dusting of compost over farm fields, and they found they were just doing one dusting was increasing plant growth rate by, I think it was like roughly 75% for up to 4 years, just from that one dusting of compost.
Wow. Wow. Thanks for letting me ask a lot of questions. There's one more that's on my mind, which is if cover crops are good because their roots go down in and then fix the nitrogen, why is grass different?
Well, it depends on the cover crop. So, grass, the reason I don't like it, and actually I have planted the native grasses because native grasses are bunch grasses generally. They don't push out everything else. A lot of our non-native grasses, the ones we use in lawns, we want that dense, thick lawn normally. So they spread and form a dense mat, and they basically choke out everything else. And that's why we selected them, because they're really good at doing that. And so I don't like those type of grasses. I don't mind the bunch grasses. And actually, in a prairie meadow environment, the grasses are a critical component, and grasslands can actually build soil faster than a forest. But it needs to be that diverse, hundreds of species of a grassland, as opposed to our monoculture pastures and lawns.
Thank you.
Sort of related question. Do you plant non-native perennial ground covers, or do you prefer the native ones? I'm talking about like non-native clover or alfalfa.
It depends on kind of what I'm doing. I do plant some non-natives. My rule is though, is if I can, I'll use a native, if there's a native available. So there's this year, actually, I'm getting ready to get some starts going of a native clover that I've never grown before, but I want to try it out. I've done the red clover, the non-native one, and I'm hoping that the springbank clover, that I can start growing it, in part because it produces a root crop that used to be a staple food source for native peoples. And they still would use it. It's just becoming pretty rare today. So, but it used to be cultivated pretty heavily by the native peoples.
Right. Yeah, I got a start of that and planted it last year. I'm hoping it comes back and spreads.
Yeah. So, it's a mix. I'm always looking for more native ground covers, but I have the non-native strawberries too. And, I definitely do grow natives, or non-natives, but I tend to try to find non-natives that are providing some other benefit too, like they provide a food source or something that I just can't get very easily from a native plant. But in general, I'll use a native if I can. And miner's lettuce and Pacific waterleaf are two great ones. But there's also woodland sorrel that it needs deep shade, but I just planted a bunch of it this fall because I finally have enough shade to grow it. And it can just form a dense mat, and it will grow under conifers too, which is nice.
Excellent. I just make sure we're not missing any questions in the chat. Let's see. Somebody mentioned Pacific 9 bark is also a good native shrub.
Definitely. I have some of that down near my wetland.
And the checker mallow was another native you mentioned.
Yeah, Henderson checker mallow. There's also rose checker mallow, and then another one called meadow checker mallow that I'm trying out.
Excellent.
And they grow really easy. They've just been super easy to transplant and to plant in, and great winter green too, and year-round green.
Yeah. The, Henderson, I think the Henderson checker mallow was another one I planted, and it's still green, which is just awesome.
Where are you getting the Henderson checker mallow?
I get a lot.
Oh,
sorry. I was gonna say I get a lot of plants every year from Fourth Corner Nursery up in Bellingham. They sell their wholesale bare roots generally. Sometimes they're bulbs, but you have to spend at least $200, and they come in bundles of like 50 plants per bundle. But if you're okay with those kind of restrictions, they're a great option because the plants are only about $1 or so per plant. So you can get a lot of plants. I just put in another 300 or so native edible plants in this fall that way because they're it's just a lot cheaper to do it that way than to buy individual plants.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that resource. And if you're just looking for a smaller quantity, I've ordered from I believe they're called Native Foods Nursery.
They're a good
one. Yeah, so you can order single plants starts from them.
And I use them too to learn about different native edibles too, just because they've documented a lot of them. Native plant salvage can be a good option. They do a plant sale every generally in the fall, sometimes in the spring now. And then also the conservation districts locally do plant sales. They don't focus on edible ones, but you can sometimes find good ones from there. There's also a nursery. There's Sound Native Plants is another nursery locally that you can get ones from. And then Woodbrook Nursery in Giggs Harbor, they have a pretty wide selection, and you can often find plants from them if you're willing to drive up to there.
Yeah, we actually drove up there a few weeks back to get living Christmas trees. We picked up a couple, 3-foot trees. Somebody asked about predators and animals that they raise. That would be problematic for them. Do you raise any animals, and how do you?
We don't at the moment. We're getting chickens this spring. And I'm going to be using a mobile chicken coop because that tends to reduce issues because you don't get rats and other rodents living, around your coop, which is the biggest reason weasels tend to show up is they chase the rats, they eat the rats, then they go for the chickens. So I'm going with a mobile system. So I'm going to have an electric poultry net that goes around their kind of area where they are at that moment. And I'm just going to keep them moving. And that should be enough to deal with coyotes. They shouldn't be a major issue with that system. Talking to other people in the area that have used this type of system, that tends to work fine. Aerial predators, again, giving them the cover, I think will work. In this case, I'm looking at options. The coop I'm looking at is actually high enough off the ground that even though it's mobile, they can get under it to kind of get out away from any aerial predators. But the biggest predator I was worried about was weasels, but they're also one of the predators I want the most because they're really good at getting rid of the rodents and for me. So my plan from reading about it is just to keep the coop moving because sounds like generally what happens is they're drawn to the rats or other rodents. And then once they run out of those, that's when they go for the chickens.
Okay, interesting.
But I would say everybody's going to be a little different, based on your own situation. And, it's a balance. Sometimes there may be predators that just don't work in your area or aren't available too, if depending on where you live. Like, there's no wolves or mountain lions or bears really, and not enough to deal with the deer in this area. So that's why I fenced off the deer because of that. So you do have to kind of look at your situation. But I would say generally anything that's small, like any insect pest, there should be a predator that you can attract to take care of it. And even rodent issues, things like that, there are options.
Yeah. Okay, great. What about raccoons? Have you found raccoons to be a problem in your wildlife pond yet?
Not so far. It's new, the wildlife pond. We have raccoons. They've been around, but so far they've never been an issue. I found one day, camping up in my cherry tree, and we see them. We get opossums too, but so far none of them have been an issue. I don't know if we've just been lucky, but yeah, so far it's been interesting. But the more I do to invite wildlife in, it seems like I'd have less issues as opposed to more.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. I had asked a question. When you plant a new plant, do you, especially a tree, or well, anyway, a new plant, do you purposefully add mycorrhiza?
Generally not purposefully, except that I'm mulching everything and, kind of promoting beneficial fungi in that way. So I'm creating the environment for them. I have occasionally, if I am digging in an area and I'm moving wood chips back to plant a tree into it, and there's just too much wood chips, more than I need to recover that area, and I can see that they're just filled with mycorrhizal, fungi, I'll move them to an area that is fresher, that doesn't have that yet. So, I'm kind of moving them around in that way, but I've never personally like bought it in that sense to kind of inoculate. Really just focus on the wood chips. And well, I guess I would say I have bought the wine cap mushrooms, because they were edible and I wanted them to have them in that sense. I'm not 100% sure what, I know there's been some research into them helping tomatoes grow, but I haven't seen if they connect with fruit trees or the woody plants or not. But otherwise, I just focus on just creating the habitat for them. And one thing too is I do feel like I'm bringing those things in because I do native plant salvage events. So I'm often digging up native plants from forest areas that are being developed, and I'll plant those in. And almost always, that bundle of soil that comes with them is going to have a lot of beneficial organisms in it, including the fungi. And then all the logs and things I'm bringing out of forests that are going to be destroyed, those too, are likely to have that. So it seems like I'm getting it through those methods instead of having to purchase it.
Thanks.
Someone mentioned their livestock guardian dog takes care of a lot of their predators and would love the shade of a forest garden. So they have the dog for hawks, possums, and all predators.
Yeah.
That could be an option.
Yeah, that can be an option if you don't feel like you can work with like coyotes or other, the wild ones. Just to have a livestock guardian dog is another option.
You said you're planning to do some roof water collection. Are you also planning to use your gray water?
Eventually, yeah. Just haven't had time to get it all set up. But it is something we're exploring.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Daron very much for coming in and give us that presentation. It's been very enlightening.
Yes, it was really excellent. Thank you. And someone asked if we can share your PDF handout, if they can share their PDF handout with their group.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, and we did remind everybody on chat that that this is being recorded. I see it's still being recorded, and that will be up on YouTube.
Great. And
thank you very much, Daron, and thank you all for coming. Really appreciate your attendance, and we'll see you all next month.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Really appreciate it.